Welcome, everyone. Just want to give everybody a chance to properly log in. So we're just going to give it a minute here. All right, well, we are going to get started. So thank you very much for tuning in for this webinar for the Adult Literacy XPRIZE. We have Katie Beck, who is the Chief Operating Officer for 4.0 Schools. And today she's going to talk to us about Introduction to Design Thinking. So I will let Katie introduce herself and 4.0 Schools, but just so everybody knows, if you do have questions, please submit those through the Google Hangout on Air. And a couple times during the presentation, Katie will pause, see if we have any questions, and then we will move on from there. So Katie, on to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who is joining us. As Ben said, my name is Katie Beck. I work at 4.0 Schools, and I'm really excited to be here because what all of you are working on is extremely important, and anything that we can do at 4.0 to support you as you develop these solutions, we're excited to do. Hopefully you see my next slide, Ben. Let me know if that doesn't happen. I am Katie. I'm an educator. I have coached over 50 startups over the last 4 years at 4.0 Schools. My email's there. It'll be back at the end of the presentation if you have questions. And 4.0 is a community and an incubator where really passionate people like yourselves launch new education startups and schools. And we do that because we believe that school really needs to evolve to meet the needs that we have today. And we feel like the best way to do that is to support entrepreneurs to launch specific solutions that solve the myriad of problems that learners face. And really briefly, we run 3 main programs: Startup Weekend Education, Essentials, which is a 3-day boot camp, and Launch, which is a 3-month accelerator program. So happy to share more about those programs offline, and hopefully today will give you a little taste of the kind of support we give entrepreneurs. So what we're going to spend our time on today is design thinking, or the design cycle. And there are many, many different frameworks that people use to think about what design thinking looks like as a process. And this is the one that I've picked to use with y'all today. We'll talk through 3 major pieces of thinking about designing something. One, really understanding your user and the problems that they're facing, the needs that they have. 2, really defining the ideas or the type of solutions that can solve that problem for that particular user. And 3, testing those ideas as quickly and cheaply as possible. One really big misconception with design is that it is both linear and that you do it one time. Neither of those things are true. I'm sure some of you have already gone through this design process once or twice or multiple times. And it's really something that you're constantly doing as an entrepreneur. You can't just go to your user, do a few interviews and feel like, all right, sweet, I've got it covered. It's really something that we're constantly going through this cycle of. And so regardless of where you are in developing your solution right now, I hope you think about how this cycle can apply to what you need to do right now, and thinking of it as not just a linear thing, but a very cyclical thing. As we go through these 3 major parts of the design framework, I'm going to turn to Monique, who is this lovely woman on the screen, who's one of the entrepreneurs that we've supported at 4.0, actually with a literacy idea. And so I'll use the evolution of her product as a way for you to think about and apply the design cycle and the tools that I'll share. And for each part of the cycle, I'm going to give a few pointers on how we think about approaching that part of the cycle, some tools that we use and encourage all entrepreneurs to use, and show you what a few of those tools will look like in action. Monique started her adventure as an entrepreneur calling her product Parents as Partners, but you'll see in slides to come, the name changes to Beyond Margins. So it'll be the same thing. And then one tool I want to share with you before we dive into each part of the cycle is this concept of a Mad Lib, which is kind of a funny thing. It takes you back to those like fun activities when you were in 6th grade. But for us, the Mad Lib can be an anchor that you're constantly evolving, and it's your current, I like to call it a gun to your head moment of who your user is, the problem they need solved, and the best way to solve it. And if you're really clear on where you are right now on those things, as you go through the design cycle, it's really about constantly evolving your idea of that to be clearer and clearer and clearer. And this is what a Mad Lib can look like. This is just one structure. It's the one we use. But blank needs a way to blank. We can accomplish this by blank. The first blank is your user. Your second blank is the problem or the need that they're facing. And the third blank is your best understanding of a way to solve that problem right now. And I would really encourage you, whether right now or later this afternoon or something, to just jot down for you, what does that look like right now? Here's an example of what Monique's looked like right at the very beginning of her journey. Parents need a way to help their kids learn to read. We can accomplish this by training them. You probably already see some of the weaknesses of this Mad Lib looking at it, but it's not really clear yet. The user is pretty broad, like all parents, do really all parents need that? The problem is still pretty not specific yet, and the solution, training them, we don't really know what that looks like. And so what the design process lets an entrepreneur like Monique do is really dig down and constantly evolve her understanding of these three pieces: the user, the problem, and their solution. So let's go through the design process and see how we can improve this Mad Lib, this understanding of a solution by the end of it. So first, we're going to dive into the understand piece of the design cycle. And you can, again, as Ben said, be thinking of any questions. I'm going to pause at the end of the understand cycle and answer any questions that we've gotten so far. So when we think about the understand piece, it's really about starting with your user and being deeply empathetic, not feeling badly, not sympathetic, but empathetic, really trying to understand what it is like to be in their shoes and what their experience is. So there's three specific pointers that I have for you before we dive into what tools you can use to really get this empathy. The first is be specific, get specific. When you looked at Monique's Mad Lib a moment ago, you saw her say her user was parents. And this is what we see with many people when they initially come to our programs, that they have a really large user group that they're assuming. And the first thing is to get really clear on what kind of parents, what moment in their parenting journey, what type of kids do they have? And you may have a very different user group than parents. Yours might be adult literacy learners. It might be a particular subset of that, but really drilling down on what the characteristics that define that user. The second pointer, which is probably my favorite concept in design, is this idea of interrogating reality. The more colloquial way to say it is that users lie, not intentionally, not maliciously, but I don't know if you guys are big fans of the medical drama House. I really enjoy it, but he always says that patients lie. And so I always say to entrepreneurs that I coach that users lie, not because they're trying to lie, but because all of our perceptions of our life are very different. If I tell you that I work out every day, that might be my aspiration of what's true. When push comes to shove and we actually look at my calendar, probably not as true. So your challenge with empathy is to really understand what's going on, not just what your users are telling you is going on. And then the third pointer is getting past the problem to the pain point. Again, when if you go back to Monique's Mad Lib, that they need to help their kids learn to read, really pushing beyond that's a problem, but what's hard about that? What is the pain point? What is the specific barrier that is making it difficult for a parent to do that? So let's look at a few tools you can use to get specific, interrogate reality, and really get down to those pain points. The first tool is an interview, and I imagine a lot of you are doing interviews already of your users, and so I'd love to share a few pointers for this. One is to push for stories, and this goes back to the issue of users lying. So if you ask, if Monique was going to parents and saying, tell me what you do at night, it would be very easy for them to say, well, every night we pick out a book and we read it and it's great. It's much more powerful for her to push her a story and to say, tell me about the last time you read with your child, because then they're really recounting something that's happened, not an amalgamation of all of their memories of something that's happening. Another way to solve for the users misremembering thing is to actually observe them and interview afterward versus having them tell you about something. So it was much more powerful when Monique went to a parent and said, can I come just see how you're doing story time at night? And then afterwards sit down for the interview and ask, why did you do that? Or why did you make that choice? Because then she's seeing actual behavior rather than a user's interpretation of their own behavior. So if your interviews to date have primarily been asking someone what they're doing, I would really push you to say, could I find a way to observe them in their own context and then interview them afterward? A few other things, this idea of testing a theory. So if you have a hunch about something that's happening, you can really use an interview to test your assumption, find out if it's happening or not. You want to continually keep asking why, not just stop at what's happening, but really try to understand what's influencing that. And then with this last bullet point, thinking about not just that moment, like for Monique, not just the moment of them reading, a story to their child, but trying to understand their broader context. How do they get home at the end of the day? What do they do after their kids go to bed? What does their morning look like? Really understanding the wider context and not just this very narrow moment. So one of the examples from Beyond Margins, which is what Monique's product became, is that she really observed parents at home with their kids and then talked to them more about it. And this was a quote from one of her users saying, when she was really trying to understand what does your time in the evening with your child look like? And this was a parent saying, we do practice at home. We say our ABCs every night. And as she spent more time with this parent, she realized that really their conception of what practice was looked very different from the appropriate level of rigor for the age of their kid. So interviewing is one tool. A second tool after you've interviewed is called a user persona. And I'll show you an example in a second, but let's say you've interviewed 10 users, done some observations of them, interviewed them. You want to start to synthesize what really holds all these people together. What makes them a user group that have a common problem? And so you can design a sort of a synthesized version of a person who has certain characteristics. So I'm going to flip to the example really quickly. This is an incomplete user persona for Beyond Margins, but you can see Anita is a fake person that Monique made up, but she has some characteristics that she saw in a group of parents she interviewed. So at the bottom where you see makes dinner frequently, she was hearing from a lot of parents that they had other responsibilities at home besides just, reading to their kid or the solution Monique wanted to see. You can see that the rest of her family is very important to her. So these are things that she saw in multiple interviews, and she's really drilling down into one example user that she can use as she thinks about the best way to solve the problem. Once you make something like this, a really good strategy is to share it with a friend who might not know that much about what you're working on, and let them push you on where they feel confused. What is missing from this persona? What are you still curious about for this person? And that fresh set of eyes can let you know, I haven't really asked anything about, who they trust or what types of websites they like to go to, or how they're spending their time in the morning, or whatever is missing. And then you can continue to modify that user persona and make it clearer and clearer and clearer. And I should be able to like pick up your user persona and be like, oh, I totally get who you're designing for. This isn't just a broad parent, it's something much, much more specific than that. And then one more tool that you can use that I really like is a journey map. And so this is to show how a user is going through an experience from start to finish. And the reason this is important is because for a lot of problems, you need to figure out where it's actually happening. What is the moment that they encounter that problem or challenge? One example, we work with a lot of entrepreneurs who are doing work with college students and trying to figure out how college students who might be the first in their family to go to college, they often struggle to navigate. And so with an entrepreneur like that, sometimes we'll say, actually show me a journey, like during their first semester, what does it actually look like the moment they struggle? And so that entrepreneur might draw a journey map of them getting their first B and how they react to that, and that they don't actually go to the academic center to get help. And that starts to really drill down on what's the moment our solution needs to intervene. And like the user persona, if you draw an initial map of this, it can be really helpful to show it to someone else and walk them through your user journey and have them say, interesting, like, why do you think they didn't have a friend who suggested that they go to the academic center? That can really help you think about the broader context and, again, what information you might be missing about your user. So after you go through this empathy, you really spend that time with users, which is the core of the understand part of the design process. You should have a lot more clarity in your first and second blanks of the Mad Lib. We should be able to picture much more what your user looks like. So Monique went from parents to busy, low literacy parents with kids under 5 who are learning to read. Much more specific. We understand their constraints, they're busy, they have low literacy levels themselves. We understand more about the moment that their kids are in. We also understand more about the problem, that this is about it being really fast, about it being easy, about them actually learning strategies. And so you want to see that level of specificity come to whatever you're working on too. So before I go on to the next section, which is all about really defining, okay, we know this is the problem, we know that this is the user group we're trying to solve it for. Does anybody have any questions, Ben, on this understand part of the process?
Thanks, Katie. No questions so far, so I just want to remind everybody that's watching the broadcast that you can submit your questions through the Google Hangout on air. I will see them, and then I can present them to Katie as we move along. So you have 2 more opportunities to ask questions during the presentation, and then you can always email me at adult.literacy.xprize.org, and we will get you answers to those questions. So Katie, please continue. This is great.
Awesome. Just to leave you with one more quote I love as you think about this understand empathy part of the work. I think it's Henry Ford, a lot of misattribution, but let's say Henry Ford said, if I had asked my user what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And so I really love that takeaway, that this isn't about saying to a user, like, what do you need? It's about really trying to understand their context and understand the needs that they're facing, and then think creatively about the best way to meet it. In Henry Ford's case, a car, instead of thinking about just giving someone what they want. So let's go on to the defining an idea part. And defining an idea, other frameworks for design separate the pieces a little bit more than this model does. So they'll say understand, and then they'll go into brainstorming and then defining. And so in this model, really flaring and thinking about all the possibilities and then narrowing that are both part of this defining an idea moment. So what do you want to do? This is the moment when you're getting specific on how this problem can be solved. Before you get specific, though, I would really encourage you to look for radical options. And this is a place that I often see entrepreneurs shortcut, because a lot of us go in thinking that we already know what the answer is. So even if we're, understanding and interviewing users, we're still like, oh, I know it's going to be an app, or it's going to be a training, or whatever the preconceived notion is in our own minds. So really forcing ourselves to look beyond that for more just interesting possibilities. Even if you end up with the same solution, you'll have explored other options to make sure it's the best one. Another place that entrepreneurs often go astray is going really big with their idea of what the solution is and really throwing the whole kitchen sink in versus thinking about what is the smallest initial feature that is needed to solve this problem. So we'll often have people say like, I'm gonna build a program and it's gonna have these parts and at the end we're gonna celebrate in this way. And you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, what is the most important thing that's needed in order to solve this problem before you add all those other things on? And last, getting really specific about what it is. Your solution should be able to fit on a Post-it note, but it should also be really clear and somebody should be able to imagine it. So it's not just something like training or, you know, an app to teach you words. I don't really know what that means, and you need to get more specific so you can actually move into the testing part, which we'll talk about next. So let's look at a few tools and examples for how to get really clear on an idea. First, as I said, brainstorming can be really powerful. And the ideal way to brainstorm is to not do it by yourself, but to really bring in somebody else who maybe doesn't even have the same level of investment or the same level of knowledge you do, because sometimes that investment can lead you to safer options or lead you to like the thing that you've already been thinking about. So grab a friend or do this yourself. But as you think about brainstorming, I always suggest set a timer and go wild. Go one idea at a time, write things down on Post-it notes so you have this whole board when you're done. Go for quantity over quality. It's really great when you have a timer for 10 minutes and usually you get your, half of your Post-it notes out in the first 2 minutes, and then you look at the timer and are like, shoot, I have 8 minutes to go. I have to keep pushing for ideas. And that forces you to sort of access parts of your creativity that you wouldn't otherwise. And this last bullet point is my very favorite trick when it comes to brainstorming, and it works even when you're doing it individually. But let's say you're brainstorming on possible ways to solve your problem, and you're starting to get to the end of your creativity. You can put a false constraint on it. You can say, as the examples I gave here, it has to be tech, or it can't use tech, or it has to be really expensive, or it has to be super, super cheap. There's a lot of other constraints you can try, but that will help shake you out of your preconceived notions. So for Monique, she came in with really feeling like it was about training, like you saw on her Mad Lib. But as it became clear what the problem was, that parents really needed strategies that were easy and quick, this might be what some of her brainstorm would look like, though I would hope there would be like 5 times as many options, not, the 4 that are here. But you can see that there's a wide range. It includes things like tech. It includes things that are totally not tech, like books with instructions. It includes things that require something totally new, and includes things like the last example that is something that they're already doing. It's just modifying it to be different. After you have brainstormed a ton of interesting ideas, one thing I really like to do is think about what is your criteria for a good solution. And this goes back to your understanding and back to your empathy. As I wrote here, it's likely linked to your user's preferences. So if Monique is trying to solve a problem for low literacy, potentially low income parents who don't all have a smartphone, having a mobile app would be a pretty silly way to try to solve that problem. So really think about what has to be true for a solution to work in the context that I want it to work. You have a list of that and you compare it to your list of brainstorm choices. So here's an example for Monique. A good solution would leverage the literacy tools that teachers are already using, wouldn't require a smartphone, etc. So question storming, this last tool I want to share with you to really define your idea, is probably my very favorite tool, because I think it really, really forces you to illuminate what you have not figured out yet and illuminate new options. So once you have your solution, you can put it on a piece of Post-it paper and then ask these questions, ideally with someone else, but you can do it yourself if you want to. So let's just pretend for a second that Monique still had training as her primary vehicle for solving this problem. We could ask a lot of questions. We could say, what are they being trained on? What are the times of the day when this will happen? Who is going to be the instructor? What if parents forget what is taught? And you really start to realize, oh my gosh, these are all these things about the solution I need to figure out that I don't know the answer to yet. So it helps you illuminate the unknowns. And then you go back and you edit that description of your solution. So Monique, after going through the defining idea portion, might end up with, she's still got the busy low literacy parents with kids under 5 learning to read. They need a way to practice reading strategies at home with speed and ease. And now she has a clearer idea of what this might look like. We can accomplish this by providing strategy instructions in take-home books. And if we went through the question storming strategy again for that last portion, her solution, we could probably get even more specific about like what kind of strategy instructions, where are they, how many, etc., what frequency, etc. All right, I will pause again there, Ben, for any questions.
Nothing so far, but I'm really enjoying how you're framing some of these issues. So looking forward to the last part here.
Awesome, cool. Definitely chime in. And I would also encourage folks to chime in. If you have anything that you feel works really well and you feel like other people would benefit from hearing that, definitely share that too. These are only a small subset of the tools and the way to think about design thinking for entrepreneurial solutions. So would love the wisdom of the crowd too. Okay, so this last section is all about taking all of the work you've done so far and actually putting it in front of users. Because any idea, it's easy to like sit in a room and feel like what you've come up with is going to work. But when rubber meets the road, it's like, do people pick this up and use it? Is it feasible? Is it implementable? So let's look at how to do that. So the things I think about with testing are the idea of first creating a prototype and then getting feedback on it. That's it. When you're creating a prototype, really think about building the roughest version possible. So that means, I'll show you Monique's example, but I mean like a model made of Post-it notes and markers, not something gorgeous. And there's a few reasons for that. One, if you make something really beautiful, people have a harder time giving you real feedback because they feel like you've made it so nice, maybe you don't want to change it very much. So the rougher you can make it, the more people will be willing to share with you. It also takes you less time. It's not really helpful for you to sit in a room for 3 days making a prototype because the goal is to get it out the door as fast as possible. The second thing we're going to talk about is getting clear on your assumptions. So when you're prototyping, you're really trying to answer a question. You have made an assumption about the answer to that question, and when you go out and testing, you find out if it's true. So Monique, as you'll see in a second, is making the assumption that parents will actually read these books she's giving them. Whether that's true or not completely depends on what happens in testing. And if it's not true, she needs to go back to the drawing board. And then the third thing, observe the user in action. This goes back to the beginning. Don't ask people what they think of something, really see how they use it and learn from that. So let's look at a few tools. Again, building a prototype, this isn't really a tool, it's just something you need to do. Build it something that demonstrates the core functionality of your idea. So a story I love, when they were coming out with the Trio, which was like a pre-BlackBerry kind of thing, the initial prototype that the entrepreneur had is that he gave people a wooden block that was like roughly the weight of what he thought the Trio would be to carry around in their pocket to see how they felt about it. Because it was a little bigger, I think, than the cell phones, and he just wanted to see like, how will people feel about this thing? Very, very rough, simple thing that he created. Again, make it physical. Don't try to tell someone about your idea. Try to create a model or make your user role play with you. So we'll often have entrepreneurs who are designing experiences. I imagine with adult literacy, some of you might be designing solutions that are ed tech. Some of you might be designing solutions that are more like trainings or ongoing programming. And people will sometimes say, well, like with ed tech, sure, I can like make a paper prototype of the different screens, but how am I supposed to prototype an experience? Well, you just take whatever you're envisioning doing and you role play a very small version of it and you see how it goes. So this is the example from Monique's Beyond Margins. She took a bunch of books that teachers were already sending home and she put a bunch of Post-it notes in the book and gave parents directions on what they should do. So you can see at the end of this page, the story says, "I'm sorry, toys cost too much." And then the Post-it note says, "How is Derek feeling right now? How do you know?" And so the parent was supposed to know, I'm supposed to ask this question and have a discussion about it. This took Monique very little money and very little time. That is what your prototype should do. Once you've got your prototype, you want to really think about defining your assumptions. And the metaphor I like to use, as you can see on your screen to talk about defining assumptions, is that your idea is this car. And for your car to actually be successful, to get to the other side, your assumptions have to prove true. And if they're not true, you need to make a different car with different assumptions. Because in Monique's example, one of her big assumptions are parents are going to read the book. Another big assumption is parents will actually ask the questions that I have put on the Post-it note. Another big assumption was parents will be able to respond in the right way to what the student says, you know, based on that question they've been asked to ask. All of these are critical assumptions, and if one or multiple prove not true, Monique needs to change. And so as you guys think about the prototypes you're testing with users, think about what are you assuming that must be true, or this is just not going to work. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs kind of stick their head in the sand and feel like they know something is going to work, but you really have to say, like, what am I assuming? And then the last thing, as you go to users and you've built a great prototype, you know what you're testing for, you know what your assumptions are, make sure that you're approaching users in the most effective way. So one, what I wrote here, don't explain your whole prototype to someone, just give it to them. See how they respond to it. Give as little direction as possible so you can actually see what they instinctively do with it. Really observe them first and then ask questions. And as you ask them questions, ask them to narrate what they're doing and thinking. So for example, if somebody's using a mobile app, I really like to say, like, just walk me through each screen what you're thinking. So somebody will say, no, I'm not sure what button to push next. That's a really important insight that you probably wouldn't get unless they were narrating, and you definitely wouldn't get if you were telling them what button to push. And it's sometimes a good tool, A/B testing, can be giving them 2 or more prototypes. Sometimes they can be totally different options. Sometimes they can be a bit of a variation on a different design of kind of the same general idea, and letting them rank their favorites, because that starts to show you what people like most about something and what they care less about. So in Monique's example here, this is a picture of a grandmother she was working with, and you can see some of the notes that the grandma shared. But what's most important is that this was a comment from afterward that Jude's grandmother shared, but Monique was actually there watching how the grandmother used the books with as little instruction as possible, because that's when you really see whether your prototype is working or not. And so the goal after prototyping and testing is that you're coming back with more clarity to your Mad Lib. That if you look at her solution at the bottom, one of the big insights that Monique realized is that parents would follow the directions, but they were struggling to have the most rigorous conversation with the kids. And so she realized that some training on the front end with teachers to help parents learn how to do that was a precondition for these books really working well. And so she edited her solution accordingly. All right, we'll pause there, Ben. Any prototyping thoughts?
No, nothing so far. I do have one general question, but I don't know if you want to address that now or a little bit later.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think we've got a lot of users here that are probably in or that are at different stages of their development. So I'm wondering, you mentioned in the beginning that this is not just something that you do, when you start, right? So a lot of the people that are watching right now that are going to be viewing this later, they might be pretty early on. They might be very far along. Maybe they've been working on something for years. How do you suggest is the best way for anybody to kind of really engage with these ideas, no matter what stage in the process they're in?
Totally. Great question. Yes. So I think it's pretty clear if you're just starting out, all the things I talked about should be highly applicable to what you're doing. But as you continue, these things stay important. So I'll just really quickly go around the circle. On the understanding side, constantly being in touch with users to understand how their needs are evolving. Let me see if I can think of an example really quickly. One of our entrepreneurs runs a program that provides substitute and enrichment teachers for all of the schools in New Orleans and now in Miami and DC. And so she started this 3 years ago, but she has to constantly be in touch with teachers, with the principals she works with to understand, are their needs evolving? Is there an additional feature or aspect of her program that she needs to think about shifting because something, their school is getting bigger, or because they are realizing that there are enrichment interests that might not have been there a few years ago. So that empathy orientation and constantly doing interviews and constantly thinking about how your user is evolving is always important. Then on the defining idea side, most entrepreneurs I know, even if they've been operating for several years, need to think about two things. One, is their core offering changing? Or are there additional features that they need to be adding? And so I think constantly stepping back and saying, is our core offering, can we brainstorm better ways to solve the user's problem than the original idea we thought about? And like at a macro level, companies that don't do this, they're the ones that get disrupted. The fact that the newspaper industry did not quickly enough step back and say, is there a better way to solve the problem that people who want information have than the way we're doing it, is why they're being left behind. So constantly redefining your core offering, but then also saying, there's a new sub problem that our user has. How can we define a new feature that solves that, even if it's only a small part of your solution? And then moving on to testing, again, constantly bringing those new features to users. And instead of, let's imagine that, we're running a big Uber. Let's take Uber for a second. When Uber wants to roll out a new feature like their meal delivery service, I am positive that they spent a lot of time thinking about how can we really define what we're trying to do here. And then they didn't roll that out to every single user immediately. I imagine they did focus groups. They really thought about how can we test this with, within 1 or 2 cities first to really get that feedback on this prototype rapidly before rolling it out broadly. And so they're still using that design cycle, even though they've been around for several years and are a multi-billion-dollar company. Does that make sense, Ben?
Yes, fantastic. I think that's going to be very useful for a lot of our users. Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, and that actually, I'm glad you asked that. That kind of brings me to my close, which is, again, this is a cycle. This is definitely not about I am in the understand phase. Now I am in the define idea phase. You're constantly using all of these tools, and it is a cycle, but I would look at it even more as a toolbox that you can pull out different tools along the way, and not something you're really rigidly following. So with that, I'll just open it up to next steps. And and any additional questions we have. But really briefly, this is my email address. I'm happy to field any questions folks have. We're going to do another one of these in a couple weeks on customer development, which I think of as like a cousin to design thinking, but more focused on sustainable business models. And this is a much less hands-on interactive taste of what we do in Essentials, which is our 3-day boot camp for early stage entrepreneurs. And so if you're interested in actually practicing this stuff as opposed to just hearing it, that can be a really great option. And then our favorite tool for a lot of these strategies is the Stanford Design School's Bootcamp Bootleg, and that includes a lot of the strategies I talked about today. So wanted to make sure you had that as well. But happy to field any other questions, Ben.
Thank you so much, Katie. I think this was a wonderful presentation. I think people are going to be very happy to go through this and kind of take you through the, kind of really dig into these ideas. I love the concept of the Mad Lib, taking you through and then constantly going back to that to improve that. So I think everybody will benefit from this. Yeah, so again, to all of our viewers now and in the future, please email Katie directly, or you can always email us, at adult.literacy@xprize.org, and we will also make sure to get you questions. We will send out the link to the video, and also we'll go over any questions. If people start sending those in, we'll send answers to those out as well. So look for that. So Katie, thank you again so much for joining us, and we'll see you on February 2nd, I believe, for the customer discovery.
Awesome. That sounds great.
All right. Thank you again.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.